Welcome everyone to another Living Life Naturally podcast. And today we have with us Nischa Phair. She is a researcher, an educator, and founder of SomaBody Pleasure Work. She's been a trauma-informed teacher, facilitator, and coach for 14 years and has held space for the growth of over 2,200 students and clients in that time. So there's no such thing in so many areas of our lives. There's no such thing as one size fits all. And especially Nischa talks about sex. So definitely no one size fits all for that. So she supports her clients to create an authentic to you relationship with pleasure. She works with clients to help them reconnect with their sexuality after trauma, breakup, pregnancy, grief, and toxic relationships. So Nischa's passionate about helping people understand the role of nervous system health in sex and pleasure, with the view to make sex safer and more enjoyable for all, and especially for survivors and women. So welcome to our show. We're thrilled to have you here, Nischa.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm thrilled to be here.
So tell us a little about yourself. Tell our audience where you're joining from.
Sure. So I'm in Toronto, and you covered a lot of ground for me there. And the one piece that I think some people tend to find interesting, while I've been researching in this field, or at least the field of nervous system and well-being for a long time, and supporting people through embodiment coaching for 14 years, it's really only in the last 5 that I started specializing in pleasure and authentic sexuality. And it rose out of my own experiences. So about 5 years ago, well, 7 years ago now, I ended an abusive relationship. And the assault on my sense of self as a sensual being, as a sexual being, as a woman, and my connection to my femininity was just really aggressive. And so I started to, just through my own work and research, understand what it is about these unhealthy relationships that are so damaging to our sense of self and to our connection to our sexuality, which is really a connection to our aliveness, our connection to pleasure, and our ability to feel open to life and all of its possibilities. So,
yeah, I think that this is especially essential for women when they get to midlife as well, because I think that they've kind of lost their identity when it comes to their sexuality.
Big time. I mean, any life change that we go through, whether it's pregnancy, breakup, divorce, menopause, major illness or injury, it changes our relationship to our bodies, to other people, to our environments, to society. We see ourselves differently. We start to maybe experience injuries differently. Our relationships change. So it follows that our relationship to pleasure and life itself would start to change as well. And I think, especially for midlife, for women, there's actually a really beautiful opportunity that while hormonally things are shifting and there may feel like there's a lower desire or interest in sex, there's actually this really beautiful opportunity to step back and explore what does it actually mean to have an authentic sexuality, because no one gave us that opportunity when we were teenagers or when we were getting married. No one said you have an expression, an identity of yourself as a sexual being, and you get to be the one to decide how that plays out, what you like, what you don't like. You get to say no to things. And so it can be this really lovely opening up of this whole other part of ourselves that we never really got to explore. We go from being children who have no sexuality whatsoever to then being thrust into the world where we're expected to be perfect in our relationships and our sexual interactions with people and have it all figured out. And so I actually really love this time, either post a long relationship or in this perimenopause, menopause time, for women to start to step back and say, well, what does this mean for me to be a woman and to have sexuality? These are questions we never get to entertain. And it's a really nice, these changes in our bodies and in our hormones are kind of a perfect foundation for being able to decide, how do I want to go forward in this next stage of my life? Who do I want to be? How do I want to show up in my body and in my relationships?
And interesting, because you talked about the nervous system and how that correlates with our sense of well-being and our sexuality. How does that work?
Well, so that's a really good question. I'm going to try and drill it down. It's complex. So our nervous systems have many different modes depending on what we are encountering or facing in our lives. The fight flight mode is the most well-known. But the rest and digest mode, which is also called parasympathetic ground, is what I like to call being in your pleasure body. So when we're in our pleasure bodies, you may feel it when you're having sex or having an orgasm, but you can also feel it when you're smelling flowers in the garden, when you're taking a really beautiful walk, watching a sunset. These are experiences in life that stimulate a way of being, way of inhabiting our bodies that allows us to feel available, feel really connected to our surroundings, feel really open to the emotional state of others and available to being vulnerable with others. So this place of being in our pleasure bodies not only supports us to have improved immunity, digestion, circulation, but it's really the fertile ground that we need to support ourselves in our relationships, our intimate relationships.
So how do you work with people when they're really struggling with this whole sexuality part of themselves?
Yeah, I actually tend to start because so most of my clients find me after an abusive or unhealthy relationship. Many of them have histories of childhood trauma or assault in their teenage or adult years. So I like to zoom way out and just start to focus on sensual pleasure, helping people to feel safe in their senses, feel safe in their pleasure bodies, so that lays the groundwork, the sort of setting this scene, if you like, for being able to experience more expansive, more intense experiences of pleasure, because the nervous system doesn't have a different scale or set of functioning for processing sexual pleasure as it does for sensual pleasure. It's all the same system. It's all the same neurotransmitters, the same hormones, same mineral balancing. It's just that we relate to it differently because sexuality is so compartmentalized and repressed in our society. So often by experiencing pleasure in these more sensual spaces, whether it's having a really nice hot bath or connecting with self-touch, that's a really great one. Then we can start to open up the sense doors to be able to experience and feel safer and more autonomous in sexual pleasure, whether it's with themselves or with a partner.
I love what you're talking about with the sensual part of it, because you mentioned flowers, and last week, actually, my granddaughter bought me some roses, a real surprise. And I just love to be able to smell and touch things like roses, but I never really thought about it before from a point of view of sensuality, because we're always in such a rush to do things that we don't take the time to basically smell the roses. Just like when we're in nature, we might be rushing to take a walk, but we don't really spend the time thinking about what pleasure it gives us.
It's so true. And that's, I mean, we talked about this before we came on this call, but the pandemic and even like the last 5 or so years, they've been really heightened, stressful times to be in the world. And that has a really disadvantageous effect on our pleasure bodies, on our ability to experience pleasure. Because if our environments aren't safe, if our relationships aren't safe, we literally, our bodies close off, our sense doors become smaller, and we make our bodies smaller to avoid the potential threat that's in our spaces.
Mm.
So that, one of the big sort of flags that I'm flying as we come out of the pandemic is to not just open up to more experiences of being in your pleasure body, but to create, like, bring flowers to your desk and smell them every 5 minutes and just allow that experience to wash over your body. Notice what it does to your feeling of the way your bones are stacking on your skeleton, the way your heart sits in your chest. How does that affect your digestive system? And to really let ourselves be nourished by all of these healthy, healing, supportive, like ever-present qualities of our world that we become closed off to when we are in periods of chronic or traumatic stress.
Yeah, mentioning the pandemic, it's been very difficult to get that sense of touch with people.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that that's now I have to say, in our family, we've continued to hug every time we see one another. I think there was one Easter when we didn't meet right at the beginning and we were on Zoom, and it was just like, well, we might just as well not be here. I mean, not having that sense of touch and nearness to our loved ones is really detrimental. So I can certainly understand why people have become more depressed, more anxious.
Mm-hmm.
So people who are anxious and depressed like that, do you work with them so that they can begin to open up to pleasure even during this time when some people are still in a stringent lockdown?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about pleasure in this way. Really, it's nervous system regulation and modulation that we're doing. And simply by virtue of introducing some form of new stimulation or a new experience, you're changing how your body and your nervous system interacts with its environment, which changes you. It changes your reactions and responses. So for someone who is in a, say, period of depression or anxiety, I typically work with movement and proprioception a lot. Largely because any form of movement reinforces on a subconscious cellular tissue muscle level that I have agency. I can move when I want to. I can get up and walk to the other side of the room. I can prove to myself with my own self, body, being, that I have power. I have autonomy. I can make choices about the kind of experiences I want to have and the kind of person I want to be day to day.
So what are the benefits of having a good, healthy sexual relationship?
So that's a big question. I mean, like, it is and it isn't. On the surface, the benefits are improved well-being, improved digestion, immunity, feeling more purposeful, more alive in our lives. And that would be the Instagram post version that answer. But the other piece is that it's not easy to have a healthy sexual relationship because we are constantly, as individuals, as couples, dealing with whatever it is that we might be encountering in our histories, in our work lives, with friends, families. There's constant upheaval, and especially as a result of the last couple of years. So I have a kind of a whole system called pleasure-informed relationships, which is rooted in co-regulation, so nervous system co-regulation, and really becoming more aware of our tendencies. How do I hold my body when I walk into a room? What are my facial expressions communicating to my partner? How are we communicating to one another that we are available to intimacy and emotional connection with one another? So all of the mayhem of life, it really eats away at those subtler levels of communication that we're giving off to one another. You know, you come in after a rush day and you throw your stuff down and you just hop on the couch or whatever it is about what preceded me entering into my domestic space, I carry with me, and then it gets passed on to my partner. So having healthy sexual relationships really starts outside the bedroom, way outside the bedroom. And so that's something that I really, there's one message about healthy intimacy. That's probably one of the most important ones.
And so in today's world with shutdowns and people working remotely, you probably, for some couples, it's probably 24/7 together.
Mm-hmm.
And I would think that that can be very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, the disruption to our way of life that's happened as a result of the last couple of years is undeniable. It's interesting. I think some couples have done really well through the pandemic and others really haven't. The pandemic just served to highlight and underscore issues that perhaps were already there. You know, another piece that we don't often talk about, this is something that I hear from my clients quite often, is that there isn't enough attention being placed on the gender inequality that can happen in the home. You know, we know that the gender gap has increased by an additional 37 years, I think, over the course of 18 months. And they now believe it will take 136 years for women to catch up.
Wow.
Which is just, and as I say, I don't have that kind of time. Neither do you, neither do any of us. But the other piece is that these things kind of show us where we need to improve, and there are opportunities for growth and for both men and women. But that's really probably one of the most difficult to approach issues, and yet the one that holds the greatest amount of potential for coming together and nurturing healthier relationships, is really working to right that balance, so that, you know, mom isn't taking on 4 extra hours of labor a day to look after the kids and do the homeschooling and what have you. But it's really, really balanced.
So do you have some specific tips for our audience?
I always start with self-pleasure, whether it's sensual or sexual. There is no better and no more powerful healing tool than connecting with your own body and being responsible for the experience you have in your body. So I can be responsible for how I feel by going over and smelling the, you know, peonies that are sitting on my desk or what have you, or by keeping some essential oil near my computer so that I can pick that up and give myself this dose of pleasure to remind my body, A, I'm in charge, B, the world is good and safe and full of aliveness and vitality. So that's sort of that will always be my first port of call and recommendation for folks, is to really focus on your own relationship to pleasure, because it's only in getting to know our experience of pleasure, whether it's sexual or sensual, we can connect to our authentic selves, our authentic sexual selves, and we can really come to show up as the people we came here to be. You know, that's the greatest heartache of our modern world, is that there's so much pressure, whether it's because people are working 3 jobs to make ends meet, or because of all of the socially contrived ideas about what it means to be male and female, about what it means to be single or divorced, what it means to be in menopause or puberty, all of these things. And so it's so important, because our vitality, our aliveness is really the core of who we are as people. It's who we are on a base soul individual level. So the more we can connect with that part of ourselves, the more we'll be able to show up as that truth, that authentic truth.
And so where can people find you?
So they can find me on nischaphair.com. I have just released my first book. It's called Fawn, When No Looks Like Yes, and that's available on my website as well. Instagram as well, at Nischa Phair.
Do you do a lot on Instagram? Are you there probably the most?
That would, yes, typically I've been taking a break from Instagram to focus on getting the book launched, but I will be starting back up again. So people will be able to connect with me a little bit more regularly there for sure.
And I will most definitely be posting all of your links in the show notes so people can get to you. So I really appreciate this. Is a hard topic to discuss. Most people do not talk a whole lot about sexual well-being, and I just really appreciate it because I feel, especially for women in midlife, as you say, it's an opportunity, whereas so often we see it negatively.
So much, yeah. And it's sort of, I think there's this, as we get older, there's this kind of perception that either you have to hide it away even more. There's just this sort of decline and you have to accept it. And I really push back against that. I don't believe that at all. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. So thank you again for joining us, and we appreciate you being on here and giving us your input and your wisdom and your insight.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real treat.
Thanks.